Hello and welcome to another Thursday here on Viking.TV. Not long now until Operation Restart gets started and Viking gets sailing again. Now to my guest today, who you will so enjoy meeting, and you may even enjoy meeting him in person one day, maybe quite soon. From breeding legendary racehorses to being Prime Minister, from patronising Shakespeare's career to celebrating the world's most famous nonsense poetry, from abolishing slavery to spearheading conservation, my next guest can be truly proud of the part that his family has played in the rich tapestry of life. And that's not just the life of Britain, but also in many parts of the world. It's quite a family reputation to live up to, really, isn't it? On top of all that, as we have found before here on Viking.TV with some of our amazing guests, no matter what your history and privilege, and even if you have inherited a magnificent title and a big country estate, you have to survive in the modern world. You have to make it earn its own living. And our guests have done so in a variety of ways, and it looks like very hard work to me. And then factor in the past year of lockdown and continuing restrictions, and the constant worry must have been the stuff of nightmares. Just imagine, for instance, if you were lord of a place like this. Wow, that was a feast for the eyes, wasn't it? That was Knowsley Hall in Merseyside, quite near Liverpool, about 13 miles out of Liverpool. And it is the ancestral home of the Stanley family, the Earls of Derby. Can you imagine the heating bill? Let alone how many gardeners you would need to keep it looking that pristine and perfect. Well, you and I may roll our eyes, and thank goodness that we don't have to think about that sort of thing, but my guest today does, and I'm thrilled to invite him onto Viking.TV right now. Please meet the present Lord Derby, Edward. Lovely to meet you.
And you, Anne. Good evening.
So how has lockdown been for you? How has it been? How have you survived the last year?
It's everybody's story over the last year has been very different. It's been an extraordinary year. Initially, the sheer terror, panic of thinking this is all shut. And in our case, we have a huge wildlife park and thinking all those animals have got to be fed and looked after and no customers. We've got to heat the housing for them. And so it was a massive panic early on. But then you learn to work with it and adjust. And so we've pushed on. It's been an extraordinary year. Without anybody around, we've got into all sorts of areas to reorganize things. We've spent a lot of time thinking about the future. I don't think I've ever worked so hard or have wife, family and those staff around us. We're trying to just make for a future in such difficult circumstances.
Yeah, I mean, you look at those amazing shots of the house itself, and it's huge, and yet you've got to keep it dusted and vacuumed. Did you find yourself doing anything this year you've never done before?
Absolutely, all sorts of things we've never done before, and it's been really interesting. Yeah, as you say, a vast house, 110,000 square foot. And all the housekeeping staff were furloughed, and so it was very much family, but it was down to bare minimum of anything. But it has been getting into every cupboard and every area. I have to say, out in the gardens, as everybody remember, lockdown 1.0, the weather was absolutely stunning, which I suddenly discovered just how much watering is needed. And all weekend and all evenings and early mornings we're out there with hoses and irrigators. And I have to say, actually, our daughter was a complete superstar as she got into the greenhouses and was dealing with all the bits there. My wife was in charge of the weeding and cracking the whip at me and her sons. And we were thought not to be very good at weeding.
I mean, weeding's horrible, and when you look at those vast gardens, my sympathies go with your wife, certainly. But of course, as you were saying, there's ongoing things that you can't avoid. Things like the farm, the sheep, the animals. I mean, they're going to continue to lamb. They've been lambing, I suppose, just recently. You've had to take care of those animals.
We've absolutely had to take care of every type of animal. As you say, we're thick and fast, just drawing towards the end of the lambing season now. The lambs we've got a fantastic farmer, and he's very much supported by all his family. But actually those lambs, it's just a joy every spring to see them out and about in the park. The challenge is some of the rather more exotic animals in Knowsley Safari, because they need the warmer weather, and a lot of them have to be housed over the cooler nights and so on.
Well, I know, and this is what is so astonishing, and a bit later on you'll introduce us to your ancestor who actually thought of the idea of getting exotic animals in. But I mean, we're looking now at rhinos in your garden almost, or certainly on your land. Is there a worry that they have spent the last year thinking, oh, thank goodness, very few humans around, and they've gotten used to not having many humans around? And is there a worry that how will they take to visitors again?
You're quite right. Well, showing the footage of the pesky baboons there, they're the ones who've really missed the public. They like their fair share of windscreen wipers and squirty things to the thing, and so they've really missed the public. The other animals, it changes their reaction, but they're terribly used to them. We're very proud to be, in acreage terms, the largest safari park in the country, and the animals have looked fantastically happy. We've bred 21 white rhino, and we've given them away to other institutions in England, Scotland, Sweden, Denmark, and France. So the animals seem to thrive pretty well, whether the public are with them or without them.
Yes, it'll be interesting. Actually, you are open. The safari is open now, isn't it?
So absolutely, the 12th of April, stage 2 was the key date for us there. We can't open the restaurant, but we can open most things. We can't have the bird of prey display. We can't have the sea lion show. But in essence, in terms of families coming to drive around, and from our viewpoint, from the public's viewpoint, it's a really safe, socially distanced day out, which is what we've argued all the way through, that it's members of a family getting in their own car, in their own social bubble, to go and drive around and see these extraordinary animals in wonderfully natural surroundings. And it's really good for mental well-being. And we were rather using a slogan when we were locked down, how come you could drive out for a big map, you couldn't drive out and go to a drive-through to see a big cat? It's
Well, absolutely, and you've very definitely got a point, because just seeing the animals there, but actually not interacting with them, maybe, but at least through glass, being able to see them much more up close and personal, I think would do us all good. And of course, on May the 17th, Viking is going to start up again, going round the British Isles, going on the southern coast, particularly up as far as Liverpool. So you may actually get some Viking guests. What would they be able to see then? Mostly it would be the outdoors, the grounds.
No, we have some tours available. I believe we have 5 different groups of Viking tours coming at various dates through May and June. So they're already in the diary. Our fabulous creator, Dr. Lloyd, will take them on a tour through the house. They'll see this magnificent walnut drawing room that I'm sat in at the moment, and many of the other rooms in the house, and they will be able to walk out and about in the grounds outside as well. So we're really looking forward to welcoming the Viking customers shortly.
Well, I think people are just so willing to get out now and meet and greet people. So let's have a look at some of the pictures, for instance, that they would see. Now, you're in the walnut
drawing room, yeah.
I think I've got a picture here of the dining room, which is a very famous room because it's so enormous, and I think it houses one of the biggest ever dining tables in the land, doesn't it?
It is an utterly extraordinary room. You saw it there. I was hosting a dinner for HMS Prince of Wales, our new aircraft carrier. The room was built for a visit of George IV in 1820, and it was built by a Liverpool architect who was Wyatville's chief pupil, who was building the Waterloo Chamber in Windsor Castle at the same time. Hence, a lot of people say the rooms look rather similar. So it's a room of almost monumental scale.
What, you mean George IV just sort of got in touch one day and said to one of your ancestors, I'm thinking of popping round for dinner. So you built him a dining room.
You read these stories of people, and particularly back in Elizabethan times, families were completely bankrupted with what they had to lay on. But it is quite extraordinary that those court visits were large, extensive, very expensive. And you find it's how your house changes. One wing of the house, called the Royal Lodgings, was built for Henry VII, who was stepson of one of the forebears. And so, yep, it's get added on for them and taken down for them.
Oh, my goodness. Well, now, if I was there with you now, physically, and we were walking up and down those walls and you were pointing out the pictures above, it would be almost a history lesson, certainly a family history lesson. So can we do a bit of that now? Because the whole way you became Earls of Derby is fascinating. And that picture there is of the first Earl.
That is the first Earl, Lord Stanley, as he was known at the time. And we're back in the time here where Richard III was king. And Lord Stanley was married to Lady Margaret Beaufort, who was the mother of Henry Richmond. And so in the Wars of the Roses, we have the Yorkists and the Lancastrians. So Richard III's forces fighting against Henry Richmond's forces. And Richard III, cuddly guy that he is, kidnapped Lord Stanley's oldest son before the eve of the Battle of Bosworth Field near Leicester, and said, I have your son, you fight for me, or he will be executed. And my forebear said, I have other sons, I'll decide who I fight for. On the day of the battle, I think my forebear thought, am I going to look after my stepson's interest or there? And watched Richard III make an injudicious move, a cavalry charge, unprotected into some boggy ground. And as Shakespeare immortalizes with the line, a horse, my kingdom for a horse. Well, Lord Stanley's army, who was bigger than either the king's or Henry Richmond's, meant whichever way he thought was going to be the deciding point. And so he does come down on the side of his stepson. Shakespeare tells us how he crowns Henry VII on the battlefield and is raised to the earldom of Derby.
That's fascinating. So he went into the battle being forced to be on Richard III's side, I suppose.
No, he refused to join that side.
Refused, because a lot of history paints it the other way, that actually the first Earl of Derby was, was treacherous, but he clearly wasn't that way.
He actually decided to fight for his stepson, not his boss.
Oh, so he's not a baddie after all.
Not such a baddie after all.
I'm glad to hear it, but I mean, of course, anyone watching right now who may not know the full story, of course, of Richard III is that he was killed in that battle, and allegedly they just flung him over the back of a horse, and next convenient moment they sort of dumped him in a hole in the ground. And we'd never known what really happened to his body. Of course, it was, he was the ex-king at that point. And then you take up the story, because I'm sure you know it far better than me, but the extraordinary story of the way that we, only a few years ago, discovered Richard III's body.
An utterly extraordinary story. And so, as you rightly say, as far as we know, he was rather unceremoniously thrown over the back of a horse and taken down from Bosworth Field to the city of Leicester was the closest main conurbation. And so there was an abbey in Leicester, and so he was buried in the burial ground there. And so it became, as you say, and then lost for centuries. But when scholars started looking at it, it did seem certain he would be in the abbey grounds. And a part of that was now a car park in Leicester. And a particularly inquisitive team did years and years of research. And the bit I find utterly extraordinary was that the first space they dug up was R, you could say R for Rex, Latin for king, R for Richard, and there was the body. And this whole thing about the hunchback, and it was really just a fable, and it was Shakespearean making him into an evil baddie, but it really did become apparent that he had a bad scagliola of the backbone and was the hunchback.
And that was his body. And so it was given a proper ceremonial funeral in the end, to which you attended. Can you tell us about that? Because that was an extraordinary thing in itself.
Well, there were two things. They were both extraordinary. We had on the Sunday evening, he had gone on a carriage back to the battlefield from whence he came, and then was led back down to the cathedral. And then there were four of us who received his coffin outside the cathedral with His Royal Highness the Duke of Gloucester, and we followed the coffin into the cathedral, and then four of us placed the pall, and you can see I'm in the corner in the top right, the way you're looking at it there, to place the pall over the coffin. And what an extraordinary privilege. So there's two of us from Henry VII side and two from Richard III side. It is amazing in England that you can pull out four members of a family, two from each side, 550 years after a battle, and those same families are there occupying the same houses and come back with that same history.
Yes.
So to be involved with the burial of a king that my forebear had crowned 550 years before, a remarkable piece of British story history.
It really is. It gives you a chill actually thinking about it, what it must have felt like standing there and witnessing that yourself and being part of that ceremony. Just makes you wonder what your own ancestors would have thought.
Extraordinary.
Absolutely.
Really moving day. Then he lay in state for a few days. And so we had, the Cardinal did it because it was a Catholic service initially. And then when we all came back, because we were a Catholic country at the time, and we all came back on the Thursday and had a march around the city of Leicester. And then the Archbishop of Canterbury reinterred his remains in a new entombed position in the middle of the cathedral. Brilliant occasion.
You couldn't make it up, could you? You really couldn't. Now, look, here we are still talking about Richard III, and we've only got to the first painting in that. We've only got to the first Earl of Derby. So the second Earl, I gather, knew Henry VIII, fought with Henry VIII. That's the fifth, I think, isn't it?
That's the fifth, Ferdinando. His fame is as Lord Strange, which was the courtesy title. And when I talk about a courtesy title, that is the title held by the person who will at the next stage, when whoever their father or their grandfather dies, will become the Earl of Derby. And he had a very famous company of players. There were two really famous companies of players, the Lord Chamberlain's men and Lord Strange's men. And in that group, he had one young actor who did a bit of writing too, known as William Shakespeare. And so it is utterly extraordinary to think, and there is William Shakespeare, that here at Knowsley, William Shakespeare was writing the plays, and it's very well documented which ones he wrote for the family. And I have to say, we're very well treated in all the plays. You get sort of charge, Chester charge, on Stanley on, my forebears crowning Henry VII, all these things, some of these things that we only know the detail of these occasions from the way that Shakespeare describes them, but he was a more contemporaneous figure. And Midsummer Night's Dream was premiered at the 6th Earl's wedding at Greenwich Palace in the presence of Queen Elizabeth I.
When I said it was a rich tapestry, I wasn't wrong, was it? My goodness.
It really is a remarkable story.
And the other thing I find fascinating, as we move on maybe past another Earl, the 7th Earl, I think that's a Van Dyck painting, isn't it? Of the
7th Earl is very much Van Dyck of the 7th Earl, and there he is seen pointing out over the sea. This is to show his role as a ruler of an island over water. King Henry IV made my forebears kings of man, which I think is the most wonderful title, and my forebears changed it. The 3rd Earl said it's better to be a great lord than a petty king, and didn't want to be compete with his sovereign, and so we henceforth called ourselves Lords of Man, and the Isle of Man out in the Irish Sea, and it's a title that the Prince of Wales today, one of his titles is Lord of Man and the Isles.
And the other amazingly interesting thing, as again, if I were with you walking up and down that room, is that not only do you see the style of paintings change and the way people like to be portrayed in paintings, but and the fashions as well. It tells a story as you go. If we look at the next picture, I think I've got is of the 10th Earl. I mean, talk about a fashion statement there.
Yeah, there's a swagger portrait if ever we saw one, isn't it? I mean, he's very proud of his ermine robes and his splendidly enriched cuffs underneath his coronet. Now, he was the collector Earl, and many of the fabulous works of art that anybody coming to Knowsley Hall today would see were collected by him. So he was a great collector out on the Grand Tour.
Good. We come to the 12th Earl next, who was the one who was very keen on horses and horse racing.
The 12th Earl, I might start in the wrong order with the 12th Earl, because it's a rather unusual point in history. In 1779, he started a race. His house at Epsom, South London, is called the Oaks, and started a race for the fillies called the Oaks. And it was thought to be a great success. And so a year later, he started a similar race closed for the colts only. And at a dinner party at the Oaks, there was a toss-up between him and Sir Charles Bunbury as to what the race was going to be called. Luckily, he won the toss, and so it was called the Derby. But Bunbury had his justice because his horse Diarmid won the first running of the race.
Okay, but that is why the Derby is called the Derby.
That is why the Derby is called the Derby.
And I presume that's why big events, even football games now, are called derbies.
Actually, no, I'm going to have to take you to another sport there, the sport of rugby league. Rugby union is the sport played in the south of England and many of the international games. Rugby league is best known around Australia, is very big in it, New Zealand and the north of England. It broke away from union because it was professional, and it's a rather lovely story. So the southern end of the estate at Knowsley, the park is at the south end, it's quite a long, thin estate, is by St Helens, and St Helens Rugby League Club play at Knowsley Road. And the north end of the estate is a town called Wigan. And to this day, and so whenever Wigan and St Helens played, it was called the local derby as the north and the south of the estate. And it always happened on the Easter bank holiday. And obviously a league during the year, everybody plays everybody, but the Super League draw is rigged to this day so that Saints and Wigan will always play each other the Easter bank holiday weekend.
Oh, I love it. My goodness. That's
as you say, that expression, the local derby, has really spread out into football. And
still your name though. Let's go on to the 13th Earl. Now, he is the one who knew Edward Lear well.
He is the one who knew Edward Lear, the 13th Earl. He dabbled in politics a little bit early on, but it wasn't particularly his bag. He was a great natural historian, and he ran a huge menagerie here at Knowsley. He had people collecting species from all around the world. There is the Stanley crane. My family surname is Stanley. The Derby title is just held by the head of the family. So you have the Stanley crane. The Lord Derby eland is the biggest of all of the antelopes from all across the world. And natural historians tell me that the notes on all his bits and pieces are meticulous and accurate. And in fact, when he died, he left his collection to the Corporation of Liverpool, and it was called the Derby Museum. It's now the World Museum Liverpool, and going to this day. And what's fascinating is being able to match up their specimens, the Natural History Museum specimens, with the Edward Lear paintings that here. Yes. Thanks to Edward Lear, my forebear was president of the Zoological Society of London, Regent's Park Zoo, as many would know it. And he found Edward Lear as a teenager painting there. He was so impressed by his work that he brought him up to come and paint the menagerie at Knowsley.
And did he actually compose The Owl and the Pussycat where you are?
So Edward Lear came up and he painted the menagerie over 5 years here, and painted many of the Gould volumes of Birds of Australia or Birds of America. Most of the illustrations in that are done by Edward Lear too. And when Lear was here, he was quite a shy and retiring man, and he didn't particularly fit into the dining room or the steward's room or the servants' hall, and the place where he was most comfortable was in the nurseries. And so he wrote his nonsense rhymes. And if you get out a volume of Edward Lear's nonsense rhymes, at the beginning, if you read the dedication page, it says to the grandchildren, great-grandchildren, grandnephews and grandnieces of Edward 13th Earl of Derby by Edward Lear. So it's an absolutely clear linkage made to his nonsense rhymes, of which you say The Owl and the Pussycat is the most famous one.
Of course, yes. Okay, we'll move on to the 14th Earl, who became Prime Minister 3 times.
He came Prime Minister 3 times. Many people, when they did the grand tour after leaving school or whatever, and went off around Europe for a bit, he went straight up to Oxford. He was a classic scholar, and instead of going around Rome and the famous places of Florence and Venice or whatever, he went to America. He wrote 6 volumes manuscript journal of his journey around America, and in it he describes in fantastic detail his abhorrence of slavery and everything about it. And he says he will go into slavery, he will go into politics to abolish slavery. Many people are very much aware of William Wilberforce, whose Act of 1807 abolishes the international trade in slaves. But it's Lord Stanley's Act of 1833 that abolishes slavery in the British Empire, which is a very different thing, because clearly many slaves went on existing in those countries and slaves were giving birth, and so there was a perpetuation to it. So it is the Stanley Act of 1833 that abolished it in the British Empire and really killed it off.
That must make you proud. Now, I'm a bit confused about the 16th Earl, because the only picture I've got of him is in snow, and I'm not even sure it's him. Can you elucidate?
I am going to elucidate. I'm going to just slightly backtrack you there, very, very slightly. So the 14th Earl was a remarkable man in what he did. 3 times Prime Minister, abolished slavery, the Reform Bill to open up the franchise to a great many. And he had his son in his cabinet as well as Foreign Secretary, the 15th Earl. And to some of your viewers looking around the world, they may have come across Fort Stanley in Hong Kong. They may have come across Port Stanley in the Falkland Islands, both named after the 14 and 15 Earls. And after my grandfather in the cabinet, if you go to Antarctica, you've got Stanley Island there. And so the 15th Earl, Foreign Secretary, he married Salisbury's widow in later life and didn't have children. So his younger brother acceded to the title, and he had been made Lord Stanley in his own right. He was Governor General out in Canada, and he loved his time in Canada. He went out there in 1888. He loved life in the capital. He loved life out in the countryside, and he bought a property down by the river. He loved the fishing, and that is absolutely Frederick Arthur, 16th Earl of Derby, as Lord Stanley with his snowshoes on there. And for those who travel across it, they built the Trans-Canadian Railway, and he took the first Canadian journey once the line opened, the whole way across the country. And so it lasted for weeks as he met all sorts of people on the journey. And when he got to its destination in Vancouver, he opened Stanley Park in Vancouver. And amazingly, for a man in that era, and anybody who visits Stanley Park to this day will see the statue. And underneath that statue, and I ask you to remember, this is 1890, it says, this park is for the enjoyment of all peoples, of all colours and all creeds henceforth.
Excellent.
Pretty brilliant statement.
Yeah, isn't it?
Ago.
I gather they even named an ice hockey championship after him.
He presented a cup, the Stanley Cup, and that is an extraordinary trophy played for to this day by the best teams on the North American continent. Some iconic images of it.
Absolutely. Okay, we're walking underneath the picture of the 17th Earl now, who was Secretary of State for War during the First World War.
Yes, I would. If you ask me which of your forebears would you like to meet and what would you like to have seen, I think he is the man who I would have found most fascinating to have met. He was, like many of my family, a Grenadier Guard. He fought in the Boer War. He was Lord Roberts' secretary out there. He came back. He left the army. He went into politics. He was Postmaster General. And at the outbreak of war, he was very anti-subscription. And he said, you shouldn't have subscription. It is the duty of every aristocrat to go and raise volunteers from their area. As good as his word, he went out, he campaigned, and he gave speeches across Liverpool, Warrington, Manchester, all around the area. And that resulted in a huge jam outside St George's Hall in Liverpool. And the first 3,000 that signed up under his thing all came and were all billeted here in the park at Knowsley.
Goodness.
The King granted permission for them to be known as the Derby Pals, and they wear a cap badge of the Eagle and Child, which is our family crest. And so it was really remarkable that they were all billeted here. So it was several thousand of them, but then went off and they backfilled. They had some other barracks in Prescott. And it led the idea, because what he said is those men who know each other, they've come from the same, he had this concept of the Pals Battalion. So those who work in the same factory together, in the same office, in the same profession, live in the same city, they will be a more cohesive force together. He was absolutely right.
We've actually had a question in about that very period. You probably know this. Alison from Cheltenham has written in already. She said she can't watch it live, but she's going to watch it later. But she said, I would love more information about Knowsley being a command depot in World War I. I have a photograph of my grandfather working in the depot for the war effort as he was wounded out of active service in the army, having been wounded twice in France in 1915. His trade was a master carpenter, and it is in this capacity that he worked at Knowsley Command Depot on Lord Derby's estate.
Well, if we're going to talk about the wartime use of the house, yes, so as I say, there were several thousand troops billeted outside the house. And then my great-grandfather, so as I said, then in 1916, he did become Secretary of State for War. What an extraordinary period. And you look at the visitors' books and you can see the generals and so on coming through. And so he did, in one wing of the house, set up a hospital for convalescent soldiers. It was about 100 in that hospital. And my great-grandmother was jolly well not going to be outdone by this. So she set up a convalescent hospital in another wing, and her convalescent hospital was for female railway workers and munitions workers. And they are part of the untold, unsung story. And what they did was amazing, working with no modern health and safety, building bombs, rockets with some of these explosives that had some very nasty effects, cancer giving things. So they really needed some pedaling back and some recuperative treatment. And so it really was kept busy. The Second World War, Knowsley Hall carried on with its role. By this stage, the 17th Earl was a pretty old man. And the battle at the Atlantic, that is the battle to look after the convoys, bringing all the ships, food supplies, munitions, men, troops, planes, everything from America. Those convoys were vital. It was the only battle that lasted the entire Second World War. And it was fought out from The cellars, many people know the Cabinet War Rooms in London, but up here in Liverpool, Derby House has some incredible cellars underneath it, just called Derby House, nothing to do with my family, but that was the headquarters of the Battle of the Atlantic, and the admirals lived here in Knowsley Hall. And the state dining room, the massive room we're on our picture journey around, you saw at the beginning, had the replica of the huge maps of the whole of the Atlantic Ocean, all the islands. So it was the reserve headquarters here. So we really played our part in both world wars.
Well, I mean,
the family remains in you follow the family history and you're kind of following British history.
Yes, well, absolutely you are. When you come from a family such as yours, you brought us to the Second World War, which brings us to the 18th Earl, who was awarded the Military Cross, I gather. And he also founded, didn't he, the current safari park?
So absolutely, John Derby, the 18th Earl, and so he fought. He was a grenadier. He was involved in the landings in Italy, and then he won a military cross at Anzio the same day that his adjutant was awarded the Philip Sidney was awarded the Victoria Cross. There was some terrible fighting there, and yes, in 1971 he established Knowsley Safari Park. So we had our 50th anniversary later this year. I think it was really important to recognise after the war. Many of your viewers will have watched Downton Abbey, which sort of starts to illustrate the story starting around the time of the First World War about how life in these extraordinary stately homes is changing. The men are lost in the war, the taxation to pay for wars. There isn't going to be the same kind of labour, there isn't the same wealth, there is a different taxation system. The world as they knew it has changed and moved on. And the Second World War just took that on absolutely in spades. And so it's really over the last 50 years, probably the 1960s is the point at which that change is really afoot. Longleat led the way with the safari park in 1966. Knowsley, I think, was second in 1971. And so what it did was resonate with the history, looking back at the 13th Earl's menagerie. And it was providing public access. It was bringing, so it was giving the public something to do. It was giving access to the park, but absolutely vitally, it was bringing in a commercial income that could help support an incredibly expensive building, an incredibly expensive park.
So we have done full circle in a way, because we've come back to you now. You are the 19th Earl. How did you inherit?
So I inherited, my father was the youngest of three brothers. He died when I was 9, and the oldest brother, John Derby, was married and they never had children. The middle brother, Richard Stanley, married when I was 4 or 5 years old. And rather remarkably, he didn't have children either. So I did not grow up with any expectation that this is where I would end up. As years went by, it became an increasing possibility, then probability, particularly when my aunt died, the middle brother's wife died in the 1970s, and so there were then 2 older men, neither of whom have had any children, but you know, anybody, either of them could have remarried at any stage, and so it was not a definite thing that I would become the next Earl until the day I did.
And you, by then, were living a very London-centric life. You were working in the city and other things. So was it a joy or a burden to suddenly inherit?
As you say, I was working in the city. I had previously been a soldier. I'd been a Grenadier Guard like many of the family. My uncle died, and I would say, when I'm asked that question often, and I never look backwards and I never have any of the regrets about it. They are hugely challenging places to keep going. The amount of unbelievably long days and 7-day workings at time. But I would absolutely say the privilege to have taken it on, the people I've met when you have queens and princes and staying, you have American presidents coming to visit. So there is absolutely no void. Stars of television and film. So I have met some extraordinary people. That's the sort of posh and famous end, if you like, but at the other end, engaging, and I'm involved with about 100 different charities, predominantly all in the Northwest, and it's given me an unbelievable time meeting utterly extraordinary unsung heroes doing all sorts of things that I would never have come across otherwise. So I never have a nanosecond of regret, and I get into bed at night feeling very tired, but with a smile upon my face, thinking I've tried to do something better today.
But I gather not 1 year has gone by without you having to pay to have something done to the roof.
Oh yeah, you've got a roof in many sections, and it's an extraordinary house. It's remarkable. It's amazing. And you know, we've had here, we have various events and private dinners and corporate charities, business evenings, and weddings. So it's how to keep a stately home relevant in the 21st century, and that's not the way of the past. But we still need to keep it at the heart, and we believe people coming in it and having it to raise money for their charity, to allow it to be re-envisaged, and people have it as their home for the day for a film, or they come on some of our special guided tours that go into all sorts of different areas. So it's relevant, but there was no economic activity at all through the entire lockdown. And then in March, we had some filming. We had Peaky Blinders came to do a bit of filming here, and there's a remake of a Michael Payne 1965 film called The Ipcress Files coming along. Yes. And if I say that all the revenue from all of that filming paid to refurbish the windows on one facade.
Crumbs. That puts things in perspective. I don't envy you. You've brought up your lovely 3 children there, and I just wanted to show everybody this little clip from a documentary which was made about your wonderful legendary racehorse Ouija board, of which more anon. We've got a lovely picture of Ouija board here. For those who don't know racing, she was a legend, but we'll hear a bit more about her in a moment. First of all, though, I want everyone to see this little clip that shows actually just the effect that that racehorse, had on your family and her trainer, Ed Dunlop, who gets emotional just talking about her. But I would show everybody, please, watch out for the children and what they have to say at the end of this little short clip, because it's lovely.
For me, I've been very lucky to have her. I'll remember forever. The Derbys have been fantastically kind to us. They have looked after the staff brilliantly. They have kindly taken us on holiday. We've had some great occasions, and we've become great friends.
To have a horse like that, and for it to be owned by friends, and you know, with the Stanleys also, we've had such a fun time all together, and we couldn't really have, I don't think, enjoyed it any more than we have done.
The whole thing about Ouija board was that she was a dream that developed and we went with. And even if we don't have another dream, there's always the possibility of the dream.
This horse has changed our lives, and it's just helped us to raise the ante.
I hope she wins every race. She's in retirement. She retired, so she's not going to race again. Well, I hope that her foal lives to be as good as her, but there'll obviously never be another Ouija board.
It's a dream come true, and you know, it's wonderful that it happened to all of us when we're young enough to benefit from that success. I'd like to think we could, you know, we're going to have the pleasure of breeding from her, and it will be very exciting to have a chance now to build up the stud.
We didn't realise that she was going to be such a star, and it was beyond all our hopes and dreams that she could ever be as sort of famous and achieve as much as she has.
She was just very, very special. She's one in a million.
She's changed my life, not only as a person, but as a trainer. I will never train another Ouija board.
Well, I think you all get pretty emotional when you think about Ouija board and the amazing difference she made to your lives.
It was the most incredible journey, and with a name like Derby, you're so intertwined with the whole history of racing, and to have ended up breeding a horse like that is absolutely incredible.
How did her story even start? Where did you get her from?
So she was bred on the family have a stud, Stanley House stud in Newmarket. My younger brother, Peter Stanley, who saw briefly in the clip there, is a brilliant manager of the stud. And he said, I think this mare selection board would go really well with this new first season sire, Cape Cross. I think it'd be a good mating for her. I said, great, we'll go with that mating on your recommendation. Then my great-grandfather, 17th Earl, had won 21 classics, so he was really the preeminent breeder of his day. And there you can see the whole family being lunatic about it. And my mother said, what about Ouija board? I said, perfect, because the name works with the breeding. With a racehorse, you try to use the parents' names to get something. So she was by Ouija, out of selection board. Oh. And I said, what's really weird is what you would never know is that selection board's mother, dam, as we would say in racing terms, was Ouija. So what my uncle and aunt used to name in one generation, you've reversed in another generation, and you never met each other and didn't know. So it was a lovely piece of history there.
She had the most amazing career. She won so many of the races that she went in.
She was absolutely remarkable, and I have to say that day we happened to be guests of the Queen in the Royal Box, and it was all decorum was lost, with quite a lot of shrieking going on in the back row. And I thought Her Majesty would forgive all, and I'll have to say, at the end of the race, the Duke of Edinburgh turned round and gave one of his wonderfully quizzical looks. And a rather marvellous remark, he said, I thought an egg was being laid there. The utter excitement of us all was just brilliant.
And I mean, people don't know racing, won't know the story particularly well, but she was legendary, that horse, because I gather she had to be retired in the end because she was injured. But had she gone on just a couple more races, she would have probably been the highest earning British racehorse ever.
She was for several years the highest earning British filly, and within a shout of the highest earning horse. And as you rightly say, her last race was due to be the Hong Kong Vase, which she had won already the previous year. She was out there. She was in great form. The other horses have won 3 Group 1s between them. That's the very highest grade of race. She'd won 7. So she theoretically would have stolen a march, and sadly on the morning she just pulled up lane. It wasn't to be. That was the end of an amazing story, but we had such an incredible journey. We all shed a lot of tears. It was very emotional, but she owed us nothing. She had been taken into the nation's heart. And you know, it's lovely that Claire Balding video. It just shows how she was wrapped up in the whole thing. I wrote a book about her, and you know, she traveled 120,000 kilometers around the globe. She had fan club everywhere.
Yeah, she was known in the United States, wasn't she? She won 2 very prestigious awards there.
She did. She won 2 Eclipse Awards there. She won the Breeders' Cup twice, and was second once. And the third time, I was very pleased that it was Churchill Downs, Kentucky, kind of the home of American racing. And when I look back in the old cuttings files here, I tried to be very polite and talk about the Kentucky Derby, and it amused me finding a 1930s press cutting saying Lord DAR-BEE exclamation mark is going to visit for our big race this weekend. So
Lord Derby is visiting the Derby. But of course, we mustn't talk about her as though that was the end of her. It was the end of her career, but she went on.
That was the end of her racing career, and so she retired back to the family stud in Newmarket, where every foal she's produced has been a winner. Most famously, Australia that won the Derby. So I am one of a minute group of people who can be proud enough to say that they have bred a Derby and an Oaks winner, and so it's been a great family piece.
We so much of this story keeps coming
wife,
back,
children, brother, and looking back in history. Extraordinary story. Yeah.
Absolutely. Oh, let's zoom right into the modern day then and talk about Knowsley and the fact that it's a wedding venue. We've got some wonderful pictures of just the way the house can be taken over by a big wedding. And of course, that must be an enormous part of revenue for you, at least in a normal year.
Yeah, it's really important for us. My uncle and aunt gave up the unequal struggle back in the 1960s and moved out of Knowsley Hall and built a house in the park where they lived. And we live there as a family now. And the house was let out to Merseyside police for about 30 years. And the chief constable said, just when my wife and I were engaged in 1995, and said, we're moving out at the end of 1997. It doesn't work for modern policing. My wife and I and everybody had a good scrabble to think around what we're going to do. Were we going to break it up into maisonettes? Well, when you've got a state dining room that's 50 foot high, I mean, you know, how do you put that in a maisonette? We decided the only thing to do was to try to restore it to its former glory. And that I have to give incredible praise to my wife's energy. She led the project. She did not do it with an interior designer. She had some help from her sister but most of the room she did on herself. One or two other people helped a bit, but it was her vision. It was her design. We restored it back to its former glory, and this is right in the middle of having one young child pregnant with another one, and it was, I cannot believe the effort that went into making it but what it is today. And so we kind of had a year of that total replumb bit. There was no central heating in large areas of it. There was no electricity in some parts of the house. It was a monumental project. You know, you've seen some images of how fantastic it looks after restoration.
It really does. I mean, right up to the ceilings. You have to be able to take a 360-degree view of it, don't you? Everything has to be perfect, and it really does look that way. How many rooms have been done and how many still to do?
I really couldn't say. We have done up we've done up 19 bedrooms en suite so far because we use them for corporate away days, board meetings. People come along and take it with an extended family group for a Ruby wedding anniversary or something. It's just wonderful to be able to have whole families in, and weddings, as you say, are a big part of our market. The staterooms have all been done, but it's not just do it and go away. It's by the time you do this room and then you do that room and then you do the one beyond, then another one looks really tired. So since we did the major works in 1998, there is not a year where we have not had to tackle something. You know, it's just, it's a constantly evolving program. There's always work having to be done. I was determined when Liverpool was capital of culture in 2008 that it would have some 5-star accommodation. We got it for Knowsley Hall, and Knowsley Hall was Liverpool City Region's only 5-star accommodation for being European and capital of culture. So I'm really proud of the part that my wife and I can help play in the city region. And
congratulations, and to her too. Back to the animals, meanwhile, because they've still got to be looked after. You clearly believe the way you have created the safari adventure in trying to get people as up close and personal with the animals as you possibly can, which has given us some remarkable photos again. If you look at some of these photographs, I still find it absolutely crazy that we can be just 13 miles outside of Liverpool and only a couple of yards away from this amazing white rhinos. They're huge, aren't they?
They're absolutely extraordinary, and 16-month gestation and size and scale of them, but they're so cute when they're born because they don't have any horns at first, and there's giraffe. And sadly, one of the things about lockdown is that we have a giraffe viewing platform, so you can get up and eyeball them and see these extraordinary black tongues that are so long to strip the browse off the trees and not get sunburned. And sadly, we can't do that because it's social distancing, but we look forward to being able to get back to that pretty soon.
And look at that. I mean, sometimes, yes, these confrontations are very close.
Oh, the pride of lions rejoice, and they just look so happy and relaxed lying down most of the time. And when it comes to walking across the road, I think it's pretty clear who's going to give way.
Absolutely. But you've also built it in a way, well, yes, look at that. You've deliberately built it also in a way where you can get, well, it looks astonishing, but you can get very close.
Yeah, what we would say is my uncle built it in the 1970s, indeed what was right then, and what I would say is knowledge, welfare, everything's moved on a very long way. And so if I said it was a 1970s safari, which was a drive around with a fun fair at the end of it, we've tried to really change that. In our time, we've rebuilt every single animal house on the place. And we've tried to change that balance. The drive around is there all the same length, but then it's a much bigger walk around, and try and teach people more in our woodland walk about native birds, native flora, our trees and cycles there. You saw an image there of the Amur tiger, better known as the Siberian tiger, the largest of all the subspecies. The Amur forest, the Amur river, is what separates Russia and China. When you've got a president on one side who likes to be seen hunting animals and people on the other side who like to eat every type of extraordinary thing, you can understand why there are less than 500 of these in the wild. So we're really trying to improve our knowledge work more and more with truly endangered species. You saw that little tunnel. We thought a fun thing for kids to be able to go through, but of course actually the tigers are really intrigued by the little kids, and so we wondered whether the kids would see anything, and they regularly get the view.
I bet they do, yes, indeed. And is it a way as well of bringing this whole safari park thing into the 21st century, in that you do a lot of work now with conservation in other parts of the world, don't you?
That's absolutely right. And when I reflect back and look at our 40th anniversary 10 years ago, we had a fabulous display of the black and white pictures of the early days and looking backwards. The 50th is all about looking forward. We've formed a foundation which is going to be more formally launched as part of our piece. But what we're doing is with our conservation work, what we're doing, you've seen Eld's deer in Cambodia, they're Mongolia, the Bactrian camels. So what we're doing is taking our staff with their wonderful knowledge and sending them out for 2 or 3 week visits to go and help work with local people and improve their knowledge about it. Senegal is the Lord Derby eland. There are only about 300 of these left on the planet. The western subspecies of it only exists in Senegal. There's an eastern subspecies that's in the Central African Republic. So we're trying to help the Senegalese. We're trying to do DNA work, data analysis, help them improve their knowledge of how to look after them. So we think this makes, we don't have the deep pockets to be able to go and send huge checks, but we think to actually send people out to really help work and train the locals is really interesting and improving. And just for example, in Mongolia, their camels were all sort of kept in sort of fenced off, and we said, well, why not let them run when there's grass out there and they can go and grazing, and just corral them more when they can't do that, and they're going to come back to you because you're nomadic. They have the history of going with you, and then you don't need to corral them all the time. And so it's been a brilliant journey in some extraordinary places, and I'm very, very proud of Bridget and Naomi who lead our research and conservation team.
And what a learning curve you've been experiencing. Finally, because I'm very aware we're running out of time, but clearly everybody will want to know obviously being from your family, you're very close to the royal family, and I've got a lovely picture of you with the Queen and Prince Philip, who of course we're thinking of so much at the moment. And Prince Philip also came to Knowsley, I think, with something to do with the safari.
Yes, we were hugely privileged that he came here 10 a dozen times over the years, many times on private visits. In this case, it was a formal public visit, and he was opening a new area of the safari park, and that was a sculpture by a South African called Dylan Lewis that we found when we were down there. Hugely privileged. The Queen came up and stayed. She stayed here for 3 days over the Golden Jubilee leg of the northwestern leg of the Golden Jubilee tour and the opening of the Commonwealth Games. Huge privilege to have known the Duke of Edinburgh so well over the years and spent time with him. He was a really wonderful man. I'm a grenadier and colonel. He was a colonel of our regiment for 42 years, which gave me some access. The service, I thought, was so beautifully put together, beautifully choreographed, and for my wife and I, the moment of his driving ponies appearing, when I knew that tweed so well, knew that cap and gloves so well, and that was the moment for the sobbing to start. And the Land Rover, I'd spent so much time when it normally has a different back on it, and he's driven me around in it so many times, and so it was very moving. And they often say that it kind of takes a funeral or an obituary to learn so many of the good things about what people did, because people in their life are modest about their achievements. But it was a wonderful life to reflect on there.
I think it's also when because he was very old, clearly, nearly made it to 100, and he's always been there in all of our lifetimes. He's always been there, and as somebody grows older, you sort of, I suppose, take them a bit for granted. And I remember watching some what we call vox pops in the news business on the news shortly after his death, where young people were saying, "I didn't know he did so much. You know, he's always just been this old guy, but I had no idea of his achievements and what he was like." And that seems a shame, really, but in a way, good for us to reflect.
Yeah, I think he was extraordinarily forward thinking. And if you look what he did with the Duke of Edinburgh Award Scheme, and I would certainly look as a family to take the round to look how he really made it a mission to modernise the royal family. And as we draw towards the end of looking back at a long reflection of history, so I think, what he has done in modernising the royal family, and he made some strong statements, and he had some disagreements about trying to drag some of the old starched shirts. But you look at some of the modern royal advisors, and it's really you look at the way in which the royal family operate and reflect. I think he's shown himself to be a figurehead in how he's done that. And I think my wife and I have learnt a lot from that as we have tried to take a crumbling old monolithic monster of a stately home and look forward on how we engage with the local charities, the local community, and look forward. And, I'm incredibly proud of where my wife and I are. She really digs in with the NSPCC and Alderhay Hospital. I do a broader range of charities looking into the next generation. I'm really proud that our daughter said she'd had such a good education. She came out of Oxford and is now teaching GCSE maths.
Wow.
Son Ed has come out of hospital, and he's the one who will take over here. He's brilliantly involved in the business, quizzing me, telling me if ever I get a number wrong anywhere very quickly, and working as a management consultant. And our youngest Oliver is up at Durham University now. But it's you have to modernise, you have to adapt, you have to move forward. And yes, you have a strong history behind you, but if you are in Aspic, you're stuck in Aspic. And I think that's the difference between a modern stately home with a dynamic family involved and engaged with it, than, the National Trust do a brilliant job, but the history died at a date sometime in the past.
Yes.
We've got to be here.
Make it live.
We've got to drive commercialism to make it happen. We've got to justify hanging on to our old-fashioned titles and properties. We've got to pour back into the community, and we've got to make them relevant and accessible, and we have to look forwards.
Oh, brilliantly said. Thank you so much for saying it. We've got lots and lots of people who have been getting in touch, not so much with questions because you've answered most of the questions anyway, but are sending their love and saying how much they would love to come meet you and have a look around one day when it's possible. And that's not too long, as you said. And also, so just saying what a fascinating history your family has got. And it's been absolute pleasure listening to you tell their stories. And you tell the story so beautifully, as though you were related, and you are. So there you are. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been absolutely brilliant to hear your stories. I can't get over what sort of an amazing family you come from. What a legacy that is, and what a responsibility too. So the best of love to your family and to your wife, who obviously deserves an awful lot of the credit, but mostly to yourself for joining us. Thank you from that lovely, lovely room. Thank you for showing us your house and your grounds and your animals. It's been brilliant. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you very much indeed. Well, I promised you a brilliant interview again this Thursday, and wasn't it? Thank you so much to everybody who's been in touch, saying just basically how much they've enjoyed it. To so many of our loyal viewers, Janine in the United States, Dr. Stephanie in Pasadena, who said, thanks for the fantastic history lesson. The Earl of Derby should write a history book. Sue from Lexington asking about the racing. Noel said a fantastic story. Jerry saying family surnames. Stanley crops up everywhere, doesn't it? Anne is saying fabulous interview. Thank you so much. And asking about Shakespeare and the plays as well. And you'll be able to get a chance to look again as soon as this goes up live on Viking TV, or recorded rather on Viking TV tomorrow. But for now, we've been live here on Thursday evening. Do join me again, won't you, next Thursday. Couldn't be more different. My guest is Basil Charles, who's the owner of Basil's Bar in Mustique, which has long been a favoured drinking spot for royalty and A-listers. So I'm sure he's got lots of naughty stories to tell us. I'll try and get them out of him anyway. Until we meet again, keep strong, keep safe, keep well, and let's hope the sun comes out somewhere along the line. And the countdown is getting closer to Operation Restart, when we hopefully will be able to start cruising again. In the meantime, have a wonderful, safe, happy week from me and Diamond. Bye-bye.